أهلا وسهلا فيكم أعزائي المشاهدين. تنظم أسرة دار الآثار الإسلامية عدة محاضرات. محاضرة اليوم يقدمها الدكتور تامر الليثي. تابعونا، خلونا نستمتع مع هذه المحاضرة، إن شاء الله تكون مميزة.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyya, I wish you a happy and peaceful New Year. Tonight we welcome a friend. Our speaker is no stranger to Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyya. He has been here before. Tامر الليثي, tonight's speaker, did not enter the field of Islamic studies early. Rather, he at first studied economics in Cairo and became an oil company economist. It was only after he read a novel of historical fiction did he develop a passion for medieval history that thrust him into that area of study. None of this relatively late start has deterred Dr. الليثي from producing a number of intensely detailed studies in Islamic history, particularly those of medieval Cairo. In Cairo, he began his new academic career. Then Cambridge University in the UK, until he completed his PhD at Princeton University in the United States. He joined the Harvard Fellows as Junior Researcher Fellow in 2003-2006 and taught at NYU during 2007 through 2014. He is currently Assistant Professor at Johns Hopkins University. But those of you who have read the brochure's introduction to his lecture tonight already know this. What even more particularly distinguishes Professor الليثي is his use of what has become to be called material history. When one thinks of original sources material, the first thing that comes to mind are archival documents and other written material contemporary to the period being studied. Material history, which, put very simply, may be defined as using objects as original sources to build into more complex studies. Tonight, through an examination of 5 objects, i.e. private family letters, a magical talisman, an exquisite Coptic Arabic Bible, a humble petition to a bishop, and a Christian fatwa, Professor الليثي will chart a history of Egypt's Arabization in the 11th to 14th century, as well as the wider implication of this process. Speaking of objects, certain objects that you are well aware of that have no purpose as original sources should be closed and put away to make room for Professor الليثي to discuss his study in his lecture entitled Converting Objects and Words, Egypt's Arabization in 5 Objects, 11th to 14th centuries. Please join me to welcoming Professor Tامر الليثي.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the generous introduction. Thank you for the lovely invitation to come. As you've heard, I've been here before, and it was a delightful visit, and I'm very happy to be back. First, a couple of things. maybe later on I have a bad tendency to get quiet or to mumble a little bit. If somebody would just raise their hand a little bit, I'll be conscious of that and get back to speaking properly. So let me say a couple of things by way of introduction, and I'm not going to take too long doing that, so we can get to the 5 objects. This is the beginning of my attempts to collect material and begin to think about a new project. I've worked before on religious conversion, Coptic Christians converting to Islam, primarily in the 14th and 15th centuries. Now I'm turning backwards a bit and looking at this earlier period for an equally significant conversion, in this case a linguistic conversion. The move from Coptic to Arabic as the everyday language of most Egyptians in the region we call Egypt in the Middle Ages. This significantly happened well before, as I said, most Coptic Christians converted to Islam. And this has implications that we can get to. Hopefully I'll touch on in my conclusion, but we can get to in the discussion as well. What I want to do today is look at Arabization, but I'm not going to be looking at Arabization in terms of strictly the language shift, the moment when people change their language, or talk about language contact, or bilingualism, all of which are very important issues. Until now, most studies have been concerned with the question of when this happened, right? I'm going to try and use these 5 objects as starting points to illuminate the consequences of that. What does it mean once most Coptic Christians are speaking Arabic? What does that mean for the Coptic Christian tradition? How does one produce a Christian tradition in Arabic? What kind of choices were involved in this process? And how generative was it? You're going to hear about a lot of borrowings. You're going to hear about things migrating across religious communities. And one of the main things I will try to do today is try to rethink a feature of the scholarly literature on Arabization, what I think of as being rather essentialist. Basically, it begins with an essential and tight-bound connection between Arabic and Islam. So far, so good. But then sees Christian communities adopting Arabic as something that dilutes, something that carries some Islamic baggage, and therefore tend to think of it in a sort of lachrymose vein, tend to think of it as a negative development that compromises this. I hopefully want to find an alternative way to think about this. Just to give an example, one of the best read books about the Arabic Bible, the subtitle is called The Arabic Bible. The subtitle says, "The Scripture of the People of the Book in the Language of Islam." Right? Obviously, publishers make people put all kinds of things in titles, but the book inside actually spends quite a bit of time thinking about this as something that undermines or even dilutes or corrupts these Christian traditions. Instead, I want to see Arabization as a process that Copts were actively involved in shaping. And this means beginning to consider the productive changes that Arabization allowed, including access to other communities who had already Arabized to their literature. Greek Orthodox, Melkite, Rabbinite, Karaite Jews, but also and especially Islamic sources. And much of the material I will talk about has a relationship with reading these Islamic sources. To do this, I would like to center Coptic Christians as actors, as agents of their history, and to see Arabization as something that they undertake rather than something that happens to them. Now, how I will do this is, like I said, by reading close readings of 5 objects. There is a handout, which I hope you've received. Those are the 5 objects with my titles for them. Just a quick word, and again, we can return to that in the discussion. I'm not arguing that these 5 objects are typical, right, or representative. But in the tradition of microhistory, I think that they all illuminate much larger social and cultural processes, that there is nothing unique about them, and that they're excellent ways to get at these larger and often very difficult to nebulous processes. And again, when I say Arabization, I'm not meaning what I'm going to talk about today will not be strictly language shift. It will be to consider the cultural consequences of that. I'm not interested in the question of when this took place. We basically know that it started in the 10th and 11th century. That's what most studies are about, as I said. The secondary question, which is a bit more important, is whether the process began with the congregation, most lay Copts, or with the Coptic Church. It seems from the evidence that I've looked at so far that this began among ordinary Copts first, and that the Coptic Church's decision to translate the tradition was a response to that. Now that nobody speaks Coptic anymore, we can no longer send bishops who only speak Coptic. We have to send bishops who give sermons in a language people understand. We have to begin to look for translations of the Bible. And in doing so, they accessed a whole lot of earlier literature in Arabic by non-Muslim communities. So, a brief word about the background before we get to the 11th century. So the early conquests find Egypt, the Arab-Muslim conquest of Egypt, happening in 640 to 641. The period from then until about the 10th century is marked by a relative isolation of the Coptic community for two reasons. The Coptic Church was generally marginalized under Byzantine rule because they were considered heretical after 451, the Council of Chalcedon, and because of a largely rural population. So there's a demographic reason and a theological one, right? This kind of rustic profile of the Coptic community and the church constituted a kind of resource for them. It protected them from the tides of acculturation and excessive mixing with Arab Muslims who primarily settled in cities. First Fustat, and then Alexandria and other towns, Aswan, etc. By the 10th century, this begins to change. And this has something to do with the Fatimid conquest of Egypt, not because of their particular background, but because they found Cairo, which slowly booms into a metropolis, a place where anonymity allows Coptic Christians and Muslims to mix in conditions where increasingly they don't recognize the background of one another. It's also a documentary state, which means it's an empire that becomes invested in producing a lot of documents. There is a thick paper trail, right? And part of that is employing in the bureaucracy a disproportionate number of Copts. Copts were traditionally and continue through the Mamluk period, through the 15th century, to staff the fiscal bureaucracy and the administration, right? Many of those lay elites, their scribes, kutab, in the bureaucracy, become, by the 12th and 13th century, the main authors behind what we can call the Coptic Renaissance. So here the Fatimids come in. One of the developments that we see soon afterwards is a new genre. This is just an example. For the first time, based on readings of other communities' legal sources, Copts begin to produce these legal compendia, whole manuscripts that basically summarize every aspect of Coptic law. Right? These begin, as it shows here, from the 11th century. Each one of those dots is one famous one. Right? These begin here and begin to accelerate. The period in the 13th century is usually called the Coptic Renaissance. And the thing to remember about that is it's all taking place in Arabic. The Coptic Renaissance is when, for the first time, we get the study of Coptic language. We get Coptic philology for the first time. We have people writing grammars and Scala, the word lists, which is one of the objects that I'll be looking at. So we have developments like urbanization, a paper state, and with it a bureaucratization of elite, literate Copts. And those elites are the ones who become intellectuals. And most of the production that happens during the Coptic Renaissance is carried out by them rather than by clerics, by bishops or monks. Arabization also on the ground allowed many Copts to increasingly visit Muslim courts. Now, there are very basic reasons why they would begin to turn from a bishop's Christian court to an Islamic court, right, a Qadi court. First of all, the latter has power of enforcement. Right? The first one is based on consensus. Right? This one has a power of enforcement. So if you want somebody to stand behind your legal document and give it a force of action, there's an obvious reason for doing that. Over time, Islamic courts become the place where Christians, Muslims, and Jews in Egypt go as a kind of public registry, what we would understand as a public registry, right? As a place to get things done, things as intimate as family matters, marriage, divorce, inheritance, but also things that have to do with finances of the whole community, endowment, waqf, without which we cannot really understand or explain the continuation of the Coptic community. Like most other communities, endowments become a way by which communities reproduce themselves and protect their patrimony. So, this is a map of Coptic, of primary monastic and clerical sites in Coptic Egypt. The reason I'm starting here is that we want to go to Middle Egypt for our first object. First object are Susina's letters, which are from the 1060s. And they come from a town called Tishlot in Coptic, which becomes Tashlut today, and later in Arabic, and then becomes Dairut today. There we have the last extant Coptic language documentary archive. It's a very small one. It's a single family's collection of documents, 12 documents in total, dated between 1029 and 1063. This is happening in the early 11th century. So we're actually catching another interesting and very consequential process take place, which is the introduction of paper. For millennia before this, papyrus had been the primary writing medium in this part of the world, which is partly why we know much more about Roman and Byzantine Egypt than other regions of the Roman Empire. But starting from the 10th century, this new, magical, new product comes in. It's cheap, it's modular, it's easy to produce, and suddenly we have a proliferation of paper, even in small villages in Middle Egyptian countryside. This archive catches this process almost in the middle of it. We have 9 on parchment, that's the traditional medium other than papyrus, and then 3 on paper, and those are the latest of the documents that we have, including our letter. So, it's almost 1,000 years ago. It's 1063. Susina, a good Coptic Christian resident of the town of Tishlot, decides to write a letter to his friend, and he would not let the scarcity of paper get in his way. Like others, he was accustomed to recycling paper. This revolutionary new medium, like I said, with simple, modular, and much cheaper production, allowed it to replace papyrus. So recycle he did. He picked up a letter that he had just received from one Bukhtur, which is the Arabic rendition of Victor, who had barely filled the full side of one sheet of paper with his letter to Susina. So what does he do? He does something that many people do when they recycle documents. They tear a little strip from one side, right? Which is why we don't have the edges of these last words. And they consign them to the speculative archives of editors like me who start to imagine what those words could have been. The good thing is most of these expressions are very formulaic. So once we get the beginning of one of them, we can very quickly fill them in, especially letter writing in the Middle Ages. Bukhtur had written to him in Arabic, and what's remarkable about this sheet of paper is that when Susina turns it over, he writes to another friend of theirs, Agathon, in Buhairic Coptic, the other side. Both letters are dedicated to the drudgery of daily rural life. We're talking about stories of cattle, about going to court over little bits of money, but their stylistic features, I believe, preserve very telling traces of these larger historical transformation. Susina's letter to Agathon was preserved in the personal archive of Agathon, who was the final recipient of the sheet. He's the one who gets this. And we can say, without a doubt, that Susina was one of those people that I can point my finger and say, he is functionally bilingual, right? He gets a letter in Arabic. Based on some of it, he can turn it over, write in Coptic. he is still integrated into a community that is largely speaking in Coptic. Most of the other documents are Coptic, but he can write, he can read Arabic, and there are 2 other pieces in Arabic in their archives. Again, all the documents have to do with basic village life: bakery, house, plots of agricultural land, etc. Raphael, his father's will, and the deed recording the division of their estate when he dies. All of them, like I said, in Coptic, except 2, making the archive this last one that we have in the Coptic language. Now, I'm going to just mention a couple of things about this that are quite striking. Throughout the archive, in the Coptic and the 2 Arabic documents, what's really striking is one really striking thing is the dating, right? The dating is all done according to the Hijri calendar. So all of them are 400 something, 408, blah, 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 at 600 and something, right? But for the months, they're using the Coptic months. Tuba, Bashans, right? Tuba of 408 of the Hijri calendar, which is lunar. Bashans is a good solar calendar, which is much more relevant if you're trying to till land and trying to keep up with the seasons. But here we have this amazing bricolage, this mixture of the 2, which clearly made sense to the users. Nowhere, in other words, do we find the traditional Coptic means of dating, which is called the era of the martyrs, which takes as its starting point 284, the election of Diocletian, which is the guy who visited the greatest number of persecutions on the Copts. So it's a kind of commemorative calendar for the deaths and torture of these martyrs. So, like I said, we get this really particularly curious bricolage. Second, we have a series, well, one of the most important things that we see is, if we take the Arabic text, right? This is the translation. I'm going to highlight the things that are underlined and in bold, right? But on top, as you could see, there are a couple of Coptic words that have been scrammed into the few remaining spaces of the Arabic text, right? This is what he wrote. He wrote on the Coptic side, filled it up, and then decided to put a couple of words in Coptic. One of those is really interesting. It's, "I kiss your eyes," hence the title of this first object for me. This is a very common expression in Arabic letters from the period, right? "أقبل عينيك." And here we see a lovely calque, somebody translating a phrase, right, and its constituent parts into a new language and using it as a phrase in the same way. And then the other one is just an address, so that's functional. Now turning to the Arabic letter itself. Everything with just an underline is absolutely common from Muslim Arabic letters, right? You start with the Basmala, you start with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God most merciful and compassionate, right? Which is written here entirely unproblematically between 2 Copts, right? Even the layout, the idea of putting one's name at the top right-hand corner, right? Min muhibbu buqtur, from literally his lover, but it means his dear friend. Buqtur, putting it up there. Putting the basmala like with a little space between it and then beginning underneath it, not writing anything on the same line. All of these are epistolary conventions of formatting that you would find in every other Arabic letter among Muslims as well, right? And then we have the phrases. My letter to you, dear brother and master, may God prolong your life and perpetuate your high rank. See, I could fill that in because I've read so many of these letters that every time someone says this, they almost always finish it with that. And it's in, that convention we have of square brackets. And your support, and your happiness, and your well-being, right? Again, you could barely distinguish this if it were not for the Coptic calque written on top of it, and the names, which are that giveaways, but this was not between 2 Muslims. The other interesting thing, so the matter is about a head of cattle. I don't know why this isn't working. So line 8, concerning a head of cattle. And what's really interesting here is that both of them have now gone to a qadi court to resolve this matter. Right? They've decided not to go to a bishop's court on this matter, even though they're both Coptic Christians from a rural background dealing with something very mundane. And professional witnesses, al-udul, right? These are the professional witnesses in a qadi court. And then they talk about an informal agreement which takes place before the sheikh, not the qadi, but somebody, a village notable, they call it a sheikh. And then another finishing formula, were it not for that, I would have personally taken the place of this letter, right? I would have visited you instead. And then what most letters end up with, please say hello and greetings to so-and-so and so-and-so. Many of these epistolary migrations, as I'm going to call them, are evidence of intense language contact. Right? People are beginning to be bilingual, and one of the first things they're doing are importing, even before they've completely crossed over to being Arabic speakers, monolingual Arabic speakers, they've imported conventions of letter writing. Right? These have migrated. These are migrating forms, which, as I will continue to argue for the other objects, may have been accurate to call them Islamic conventions of letter writing, but when everybody's doing them, I think we can just call them local customs of letter writing in Egypt. Same for expressions like inshallah and so on. Now, moving to a second object. A novice petitions the Coptic Patriarch. And again, here my point is to show how this is indistinguishable from many petitions that we get. Petitions to the Fatimid Caliph. This is taking place during the Fatimid period, or the end of the Fatimid period. But the conventions of petition writing had changed somewhat somewhere in the middle of the Fatimid period, and we get a series of conventions that become the standard way. This is how one writes a petition. You put your name on the top right-hand corner, put aside in the margin. Right? You put the basmala up top. In this case, it's not the one Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, it's Bismillah ar-Ra'uf ar-Rahim, which begins to appear in Christian sources exclusively. It's a way to sort of mark them. And as usual, when one gets a petition, when one authority gets a petition, they turn it over and then write their decree or rescript on the back. Like the Fatimid Caliphs did, here is the alama. Here is the specific phrase used as a motto that each individual patriarch selected for themselves. Here, al-Majdu lillah, glory be to God. Right? And then he answers with in this case it was called a marsoom, a rescript. And then the alama is what's up top. This is the petition itself. Again, underlining all the things that are common among not only Muslim petitions and petitions to the Caliph, but also petitions to the Jewish head of the community, the Nagid, even in Arabic or in Judeo-Arabic. The mise en page, the layout, is exactly the same. The beginnings and the tarjama, putting the petitioner's name on the right side, on the top of the margin, uninterrupted margin. In any case, so here we have the basmala, slightly different than the one we saw in Susina's letter. And then this very common expression. It finds its beginning under the Caliph al-Amir, the Fatimid Caliph al-Amir. During his reign, the court protocol was changed. So now somebody submitting a petition has to literally enter through the chamberlains and actually kneel down and submit and kiss the ground before the Caliph. So the conventions for writing the petition themselves come to include that very process. So here it's applied to the patriarch, not the Caliph. He kisses the steps before the prospering residence. The other one would say the palace. Right? May God prolong them eternally by the permanence of their owner. May He grant them the blessings of His prayer. Exactly what you would say for the Caliph as well. right? وَيُنْهِي. So after that set of honorifics and then prayers, you say وَيُنْهِي, and he informs you, right? This is the beginning of the petition proper. I am telling you about what the problem is. The second part of the petition is, and this is what I want from you, right? So here, and informs him. In this case, this is the unique part, that the cell, the monastic cell, has livestock, houses, and revenue, and that the abbot of the cell, the petitioner says, disposes of them however he wishes. In other words, kind of arbitrarily. Next, I didn't highlight this, my mistake. Beginning of line 7, the slave. This, again, is a convention from writing petitions to the patriot, to the caliphs. You refer to yourself as al-mamluk, the slave. Whatever your station is, it doesn't mean that you're actually a slave, right? But if you are petitioning a higher authority, you refer to yourself as the slave. And then you refer to your request here. This is the second part. The slave's request is from the charity and the compassion of our father. Substitute our father for a caliph, and you have the same thing. And then is to get a marsum, precisely the same word that you would ask for from the caliph. In this case, interestingly, he wants the kind of arbitrary abbot to begin ruling according to the judgment of the sharia of the monks. And I'll get to that in a later object. But the point here is that the word sharia is beginning to be used as the exclusive word for religious law. And then he asks him that he should consider this a charitable deed, which again you see in other petitions as well. The response, this is the alama up top, glory to God forever and ever, and then issuing a decree. Basically, the marsum tells him, basically do this, basically follow the right monastic law, and at one point he calls it sharia, but another point he calls it qanun. And then praise be to God. This is the end, right? Once again, the point to remember is that everything about this, from the layout on the page to the diction to the means of addressing, right, are all now shared across these different religious communities. Now, I should say just incidentally that I'm not trying to present a picture of a rosy picture or an exaggerated form where Christians, Muslims, and Jews are holding hands and skipping down the street. The fact that they can understand each other is something we need to think about, right? But it does not necessarily mean that I'm trying to paint a picture that will, by necessity, mean harmony. Sometimes the very loss of difference becomes the very reason why conflict emerges. But we can get to that later. Now, our third object, what I call eavesdropping on a Coptic fatwa. And I say eavesdropping because, let me read it. What say you of the circumcision of Coptic children, mostly boys, is the expression here. So, Athanasius, who's the person receiving the question, says it's a regional custom, عادة بلدية, that the Copts have become well attached to. So the questioner says, is it a sunnah then? So he says, no, rather a commendable custom, عادة مستحبة. Right? Now, if you don't know who's speaking and you're behind some curtain, this could be a perfectly good text of a Muslim fatwa, right? Not only the format of the structure, fatwas begin to appear and begin to be called fatawa in Coptic legal sources from the late 12th century, but also and especially in using certain terms. Ada for custom, right? But also the classification of acts into the 5 tiers that are imported from Islamic law. Before this point, in Christian law, acts were either licit or illicit, allowed or forbidden, right? Starting from the 12th century, through Coptic intellectuals reading in Islamic jurisprudence, we begin to see them adopt the 5-tier classification of things of Islamic law. One of them is not allowed, haram, right? The other 4 are allowed to varying degrees. One is makruh, it's reprehensible, but it's allowed. One of them is neutral, yeah, it's indifferent, right? The second one is commended. You don't have to do it, but if you do it, you get special merit. This is sometimes, but not always, equated with the Prophet's example, the Sunnah. And finally, a religious duty, wajib, fard, right? From this point onwards, we begin to see Coptic jurists adopt the same classification scheme. right? In their evaluation of any act or practice or thing, right? So, one, the classification practices. Two, doesn't even stop there. Doesn't even stop at the terminology. There is also the basic principles of Islamic law are now being mapped onto Christian legal environment. For example, Ibn al-Assal, who is this very prominent 13th century jurist and who writes this big compendium of Coptic law, Majmu' al-Safawi. Safi ibn al-Assal, there were three brothers who were also very prolific. This is the one who was very close to the patriarch at the time and writes this digest of Coptic law in the mid-13th century. Incidentally, that digest of law remains the book of Coptic law until the 1980s. So think 1240s to the 1980s. Only in the mid-1980s does the previous Pope, Pope Shenouda III, make radical introductions to Coptic law and begins to disparage Ibn al-Assal's text. Why? Because Ibn al-Assal was not ordained. He was not a bishop. How can we take a book written by a lay person? This is the argument. Of course, it had done very, very well for 600 years, but 700 years. But there were other reasons, of course, why Shenouda wanted to reverse some of its rulings. So we're moving now to the principles of Islamic law. Ibn al-Assal calls what we have in Islamic law as the Nas, the text, the Quran, and in some cases the Hadith. He rather logically puts the Bible in place. So far, so good. Then to the Sunnah of the Prophet, he puts the rulings of the synods, right? And then the Ijma', the consensus of the Muslim jurists, he equates with the consensus of the patriarchs, the early patriarchs. And then what is the form of reasoning that we use to deduce from these scriptural sources actual legal rulings? He uses qiyas, right? Analogical reasoning. One can argue that it's actually impossible to deduce any laws from scripture without doing analogical reasoning. Scripture does not cover everything, right? What's interesting for me is that he calls it qiyas, right? He calls it by the very same name. And it's very clear that he's adopting more than a word. He's adopting an entire infrastructure of legal thought. He's adopting what I call, when I write about this, a deep grammar. And I call it a deep grammar. It's a grammar as in a way of structuring elements, but it's a deep grammar because after a while it becomes the way of doing things, right? It becomes almost invisible. That's how second nature it becomes. Finally, the tools or instruments of law, and like I said, fatwa become to be called that. Before that, you have people submitting questions to legal authorities, right? But again, it's the term that becomes significant here. Okay, now to our fourth item. Okay, back earlier, when I showed this timeline of Coptic sources, I showed that Coptic philology begins to appear during the Coptic Renaissance, right? Coptic Renaissance when nobody is speaking Coptic, right? Only a few intellectuals are now interested in recovering Coptic. This is a recuperative effort, and are interested in systematizing it. This is the first time somebody writes a grammar for Coptic. Nobody had written it when it was being spoken. So it's written now after the language had died, both versions of it, Buhairic and Sahidic, right? The other thing that rises in prominence during this period are the scala, the word lists, a very functional tool. You have a list of words, Coptic in one column, Arabic on the other. We see them a little in the 11th century, but they're mostly to do with agricultural items. So here, very obvious and useful things like qumash, textiles, merkib, or lists of vegetables, right? All of which are very useful, right? But then our fourth object here is kind of interesting. It starts off with basically invective. It starts off with swear words, right? What you call jins radi, somebody of a terrible background, right? And then we start getting more theological, right? The devil starts to appear in various parts. The nice one that I really like is heretikos, which is a good Greek word that makes its way into Coptic and makes its way into English, heretic, right? Somebody who shares with you the same religious tradition, but interprets it in a way that you consider totally unfounded. How do they first put it? They say, harataqi, right? Harataqi, which becomes a very common word in Arabic. But clearly, when this was composed in 1310 AD, nobody was very familiar with it. So they said, tafsiru mubda'. And what it actually means is somebody who practices bid'ah. Bid'ah comes from a very good Islamic theological moral context, and it means a heretical innovation. Somebody who institutes something anew that, because revelation was complete and the prophetic example was complete and total, here whatever is innovated anew becomes deemed heretical. By the 14th century, this changes in Muslim sources. We have a bid'ah hasana that begins to appear, right, when people talk about the celebrations of the Prophet's birthday, for example. But for its earlier history, bid'ah has a necessarily negative connotation. So we have a word, Greek, makes its way into Coptic, and it's written in exactly the same way because the script is the Greek script. Heretic, that only makes sense once it is explained through the Arabic word with reference to bid'ah. Now to our final object, what I call the gorgeous Bible. But before we get to it, I want to show you some beautiful Mamluk Qur'ans, which is not very difficult. There are lovely royal sultanic, huge Mamluk Qur'ans that are very exquisitely, ornately decorated. So here's the frontispiece, and we see the interlocking geometrical designs. There's hilya on the side, and we see for the chapter headings a floral Kufic script. Right? We see this. These are two different manuscripts. These manuscripts, which we're used to referring to in the Islamic context as a mushaf, right? That word itself becomes used for books of scripture among Christians and Jews. So in this, just an example, just from the same period, 1341, we have a Bible which is being endowed, waqf, to the patriarchate, the Coptic patriarchate, the Murqusiyya, following the tradition of Mark, the evangelist, the Orthodox, in Cairo and Alexandria. This is a later waqf. The original one was down there, and it's in that little doodle that it's referred to as the Mus'haf. Back to some more Mamluk Quran manuscripts or masahif with the same features, right? But now we begin to see the interplay between the floral Kufic and chapter titles and the actual text. And the frontispiece. Let's remember this one in particular, these in particular. Now we go to our beautiful Coptic Bible. It's an Old Testament. It's a Pentateuch, right? The Old Testament, and it currently lives in Paris at the Bibliothèque Nationale. Look, this is how it opens. Almost exactly the same interlocking designs on the first page. It was completed in 1354. And this is from my poster. So the Pentateuch, it has 5 books. Each one of them, interestingly, begins with a different basmala. This one, which is Deuteronomy, begins with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The other ones I'll get to in a second. But here we see the same decorative details. The chapter title in alternating script, the Naskhi script for the actual lines, even the convention that was observed in Mamluk Qur'ans, that in a Mamluk Mus'haf you only use an odd number of lines per page. This happens in this Pentateuch Bible as well, right? 5. And so for other ones. The only giveaway, so when I show this to somebody from afar, it looks exactly like a good Mamluk Quran, right? Only when they get closer do they realize the text, of course, but they also realize this superscript. On a few proper names, not every single one of them, a few proper names, the Coptic is inserted. It's like a learning aid for somebody who doesn't know how to write these, just to be able to recognize them. Right? Because again, in the 14th century, almost nobody except in a monastic context is speaking Coptic. Well, in a monastic context, they probably can read it and write it, but not speak it. So, Deuteronomy. The other thing to look at are these palmettes. It's almost like the Bible has been divided into verses, ayat, that need the same kind of palmettes between them as you would get in a Quran. Here is Genesis. Start with the beginning, and the basmala is different. It's Bismillah al-Khaliq al-Hayy al-Natiq, right? The creator, the ever-living, and the speaker, I'm not sure. Again, almost we see more palmettes here and more decorative ones. I'll get to those in a second. Between every 5 ones. No, a bit more in this case. Another basmala for a different book, Exodus. Bismillah al-Qadim al-Wahid al-Azali. The sempiternal, the singular, the unique, and the eternal. And again, a few aids for proper names only in Coptic. Even that decoration, the dotting between the lines, the circling line of all the letters, and then the dotting between them, we've seen earlier in Mamluk Qur'ans. And then finally, numbers. Bismillah al-Hayy al-Azali, the ever-living and sempiternal. So all of these details, including Hilya on the side, all of these are common with Mamluk Qur'ans from the mid-15th century. In a striking way. Usually earlier Coptic Bibles have some Coptic in them, so they're very easy to distinguish, and they have conventions that go back to late antiquity. They're beginning to decrease. Here is the zenith of when they become closest to a Mus'haf, a Quran manuscript in decorative details. This one I really should call an object, because I'm only talking about it in terms of visual and scribal conventions. I'm not talking about the actual text itself, right? There's a whole meta-language of visual representation here that's, I think, just as expressive and just as meaningful by way of illustrating this cultural convergence. And then we get to the very end. This is the colophon. The scribe writes about himself, deprecating as usual, and then he puts the date in the era of the martyrs, and then in the Hijri calendar, right? And then upside down, this is kind of a lineage, the lines of descent of the text. He says that it's been collated, it's been compared with a Greek one, and a Hebrew one, and a Coptic original, from an original, and so on, from this very big polymath named Ibn Kabar, who is one of the last names of the Coptic Renaissance. He's in the early 14th century. So even a manuscript has a lineage, an isnad of sorts. So those were the beginnings of the books. Those are the actual pages in between, right? So once we get past the beginnings of each of the 5 books. And again, the striking thing are the markers between what is clearly a text that has been divided anew, that has been almost made to look like these were natural versification, which they are not, or at least not in earlier ones. This is just for comparison. This is a Quran. I should have labeled that. So what we see here, which we see in Mamluk Qur'ans, we have a device that's called the Khamsa to indicate every 5th ayah. We have one that is a bit bigger for a decade, every 10 verses. And then we have the surah palmettes, right? And then medallions, which are much bigger with sort of prominent chinoiserie decoration, with the word 30. Those come much rarer after verses. All of which, again, we see in the splendid Pentateuch. So I was very happy going through all of this. And then I went to the very beginning of the manuscript and spent a lot of agonizing time on this. Ya kabikaj, saraq maraq. And then whatever that is. So I spent a lot of time trying to decipher it. And then once I deciphered it, not in a very happy way, because Ya kabikaj, saraq maraq, habas habba, yamna al-arda. I had a vague sense that it was kind of a spell, but I had no idea what to do with that. It turns out that it's actually a very fitting way. This was obviously written by the scribe at the beginning. And I'm going to just give a loose translation. Oh, kabikaj, abracadabra. Vanquisher of the pest. Preventer of rot. Right? This is an invocation to protect the manuscript from rot, from what would eat it away over time. So what is this kabikaj then? Now, the incantation, of course, is not strictly Arabic. Right? Parts of it is kind of onomatopoeic. But like I said, it's an eloquent testimony of a profound acculturation to the Arabic worlds of letters and book culture. Because I look for kabikaj, and where do I find it? I find it in dozens of Islamic manuscripts, scribbled away also at the beginning by scribes. Sometimes dozens of them in an interlocking geometrical design at the very beginning. And then I have to look further and find out what kabikaj is. And it turns out that kabikaj, which we see in these opening folios, is addressed to a protector. He's sometimes called Ya Hafid. Right? Incidentally, one of the Islamic names of God. So he's invoked for his protection. And we have various definitions of its usages, none of which kind of make sense. That alternately, that among early Arabs it was called the hyena's paw, that it was a plant known as the hyena's paw or the lion's paw, kaf al-daba or saba. Also the shajarat al-dafada, the tree of frogs, none of which make any sense. And then I find somebody who's actually thought about this very briefly and said that it was not as a plant name that it was used, that it, through a plant name that it would forge this illustrious, if unsung, career. Rather, it was used in numerous Arabic manuscripts as a magical prophylactic against worms and insects. So, although it was a toxic plant, it was also seen as a jinn, as a supernatural force that would protect books from deterioration, and therefore of assuming the mantle of a guardian. We see this in manuscripts of the Middle Ages through the early modern period, from Ottoman Turkey to Mamluk Egypt, all the way to 17th century Indonesia. The examples are by the dozen. Once you start looking for these things, you find them everywhere. And again, it seemed a very expressive detail about this. So let me conclude very briefly. I've tried to talk about Arabization through these objects and to try and think about what they tell us about the migration of certain forms, certain words, certain concepts. Again, back to the traditional way of thinking about this is that many of these conventions or forms have essential meanings or essential confessional identities. This, I don't think, is very productive, especially once they start moving across religious communities and across religious cultures and traditions. What I hope most of these stories, most of these objects have shown us, from the Arabic calque, I kiss your eyes, to the shared kabikaj, to the visual conventions and scribal conventions of the Christian biblical mushaf at the end, is that this is a story not about things and their roots, their essence, but rather about forms and their roots, their circulation. Thank you.
وفي الختام مشاهدينا الكرام ما يسعني إلا أن أشكركم على حسن المتابعة وأتمنى كل ما تقدم في هذه المحاضرة قد حاز على إعجابكم. تقبلوا تحيات وتحيات فريق العمل على أمل أن نلتقي معكم في محاضرة أخرى إن شاء الله. في أمان الله.